Unanimous consent to speak for the duration of my remarks, not to be limited by a 10-minute rule.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's an honor to serve in this body. It's an honor to serve with the men and women from whom we've just heard. The senators from whom we've just heard are some of my favorite people in the Senate. For that matter, they're some of my favorite people. I like them, Democrats and Republicans alike. They're hardworking. They've been working really hard, and they've gotten very little sleep in the last few days. Notwithstanding my great respect for them, personally and professionally, I rise today because I've got real concerns with this bill, a lot of them. Those concerns, unfortunately, can't be overcome by the respect I have for the individuals involved or my gratitude to them for their willingness to work hard for months on end and through the night on many, many nights in the recent past. These individuals are hardworking, and they genuinely want to do good. I have a different perspective on this bill. I recognize that I'm the only one with that perspective on the floor right now. But I assure you, Mr. President, I'm not alone. I'm not alone among senators, and I'm sure not alone among those I represent and those represented by the 100 of us in this body. There are a number of Americans who see that all is not well with the way we spend money, the people's money, within the federal government. And it's to them that I'd like to direct my remarks tonight. Let's talk for a minute, first of all, about infrastructure. One of the things that I think makes this an appealing piece of legislation is the fact that it deals with something that most Americans intuitively understand we need. Infrastructure is something that's somewhat uniquely positioned for government. It doesn't always have to be through government, but it can be, and it often is, because it's a public good. It's a public good that's supposed to be accessible to all, non-excludable, and it's difficult to have that without some sort of a master plan. Infrastructure is also something that can make the difference between someone having to spend hours of their life each day stuck in gridlock traffic and being able to spend time at home with their family. Infrastructure benefits us in countless ways. The fact that infrastructure is a good thing and that we need it is a different question from whether we can afford the infrastructure plan in this particular case. It's also a separate question from whether federal infrastructure is what we need, at least to this degree. Remember, Mr. President, that we are a government of powers that James Madison described as few and defined. This is in Federalist number 45. And by comparison, he described the powers reserved to the states as numerous and indefinite. The powers of Congress, and by extension the powers of the federal government, are those, for the most part, outlined in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There have been a few other powers added since then. Most of the power that we rely on in enacting legislation, the overwhelming majority of the powers we rely on, can be found in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 really does come up with a pretty limited list of powers. So look, we're in charge of national defense, trademarks, copyrights, and patents, postal roads and post offices, an immigration code to determine questions on immigration and naturalization, bankruptcy laws, declaring war, granting letters of marque and reprisal. That's one of my favorite powers because, you know, it's a power that we have to issue essentially a hall pass in the name of the United States that entitles the bearer to engage in state-sponsored acts of piracy on the high seas in the name of the United States with utter impunity. And that's really, really cool that we have that power. We don't exercise it very often, at least we haven't in the last century or so. We also have the power to regulate trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. We have the power to collect taxes and to spend that money. And I believe the best reading of that clause, Clause 1 of Article Section 1, is that, of Article 1, Section 8, is that we have the power to spend money on those powers that are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 or elsewhere. We don't have the power. In Article 1, Section 8, you won't find a generalized power that just says go out and spend things that you think would be good for the American people. Some people make the argument that that very power can, in fact, be found in Clause 1 of Article 1, Section 8. And they will refer to what they sometimes characterize as the general welfare clause. Now, the term general welfare is a term of art that appears exactly twice in the Constitution. The first time it appears is in the preamble. Remember that the preamble is a nice, lovely statement. It's not an operative provision. It doesn't convey any authority. The second time, as I mentioned, was in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. James Madison believed, and I believe that most of the Founding Fathers were with him in this belief, that, as I said a moment ago, it was intended to grant Congress the power to spend money on those things that we're put in charge of. It doesn't just mean go out and spend money on anything that we deem appropriate. There is also no power in there, in Article 1, Section 8, or elsewhere in the Constitution, that gives us the power to create jobs. Now, I understand that that is an appealing thing. People like being able to have jobs. They like an economy that provides jobs. And so when a politician can promise job creation, that sounds like an appealing feature. That in and of itself can't be our objective, and that in and of itself doesn't actually work. I'll touch on this a little more a little bit later, but we have to remember that the federal government has no ability to generate wealth. It lacks that capacity. Regardless of what you think of the federal government and the extent of federal power, the federal government can't create wealth. It can only transfer it. It can collect taxes. It can do new things. And those things can be good. They can even have positive impacts on the economy. But we lack the power to generate wealth. We therefore lack the power to create jobs. Because remember, when we're taking money, we're taking it from someone else. Taxpayers typically, or in the case of borrowed money, and we'll get more to that later, talking about future generations of Americans who will pay for this. So we're not creating jobs. We're just taking money from one group of people to do a specific job. And yes, some people might be employed in those projects. That doesn't mean we're actually creating jobs. Nor can we forget the fact that when we do something, we can always take credit for the things that we do. Those things don't necessarily take account of the things in the economy that would have happened but for our intervention. We can't take into account what hospital wings might have been built but for the fact that we took a whole bunch of money and spent it on a federal priority. So let's get back to the distinction between state power and federal power, specifically as it relates to infrastructure. I can see a number of instances in which some infrastructure projects might well be appropriate for federal spending. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower who proposed the creation of the interstate highway system back in the 1950s. One of the arguments that he came up with, in fact, as I recall, was the principal argument that President Eisenhower relied on in creating the interstate highway system, was that for purposes of national defense, we needed to have a way that we could move U.S. military personnel from one part of the country to another. He did some research on it and discovered that many parts of the country would be inaccessible from other parts of the country, and if they needed to get troops from one area to another, that could create a real national security hazard. I suppose he might also have relied on the power to regulate interstate commerce. To my knowledge, he was relying principally on the defense aspect of having an interstate highway system. So on that basis, he proposed that we create the interstate highway system. And he proposed, and Congress passed with his signature, legislation creating a gasoline tax to pay for the creation of the interstate highway system. Here was more or less the deal that he cut with the American people. He said, look, we, Congress, and the federal government as a whole will fund this. We will then fund the building of the interstate highway system. Once the interstate highway system is built, we will hand it over to the respective states, understanding that each state would have a portion of the interstate highway system running through it. We'll hand over to each state the portions of the interstate highway system running through that state. Those states will then be responsible for maintaining it and keeping it functioning and so forth. In the 7 or so decades since that plan was conceived and hatched, we have now built the interstate highway system. It is complete. The federal gasoline tax has been adjusted on several occasions since then. It's been a few decades since it's been adjusted, but it currently stands at 18.4 cents per gallon. That's the portion of what every American pays when they go to the gas pump, regardless of what other additional state tax they might pay on that gasoline. There's 18.4 cents out of every gallon that goes into the Federal Highway Trust Fund. And that's still there, notwithstanding the fact that the interstate highway system is still in existence. Now, one might ask why. Well, decisions have been made over time suggesting it might be appropriate still for us to maintain the interstate highway system using federal gasoline tax dollars. It's a decent argument, one that I can accept, notwithstanding the fact that it wasn't part of the original plan. Why then, with federal infrastructure money, do we always dip into the Federal Highway Trust Fund and have to supplement it with general fund revenues? Why is the 18.4 cents per gallon a tax, remember, that's the vestigial remains of a tax originally put in place to build it, with the understanding we'd hand it over and the states would maintain it? The question becomes an even more interesting one when you realize that it doesn't cost 18.4 cents per gallon to maintain the interstate highway system. In fact, it doesn't take anything close to that. Estimates vary some, but according to some estimates, you can do that for about 5 cents per gallon. And yet we collect 18.4 cents per gallon, and yet that's never enough, because on transportation funding, we routinely spend a lot more than that, and we have to dip into other sources of revenue, including what we collect in income tax and so forth. So why is that? Well, it's because of mission creep. Instead of just focusing on federal infrastructure, we have focused on a lot of things that are not federal infrastructure. Things that, while lovely, useful, perhaps necessary, aren't necessarily federal in nature. Things like bike paths, hiking trails, beautification projects that go alongside of a transportation corridor. In some cases, mass transit systems. In some cases, surface streets that may or may not even be connected to the interstate highway system, and that in many cases start and end entirely within one state, that are not part of the interstate network at all. So why then do we do that? I mean, we do that to a really large degree. As the sponsors of this bill that I received for the first time just moments ago, as I was sitting on the Senate floor waiting to begin my remarks, 2,702 pages long. I see it sitting near the desk clerk right now. It's a rather impressive specimen. It's a large piece of legislation. It's one that I look forward to reading. It's one that I realize will not exactly read like a fast-paced novel. Reading legislation like this and being able to digest it takes a fair amount of expertise. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes countless instances of cross-referencing to multiple existing provisions in federal law to understand. There's 2,702 pages. They've worked hard on it. It's taken them 4 months to come up with it. And even though I've got grave concerns with the legislation and can't fathom a circumstance in which I'll vote for it, although, that said, that remains to be seen depending on what we're able to change about it. You see, any piece of legislation can potentially turn into something that any member ought to be able to vote for, depending on how the amendment process goes. In its current form, I couldn't possibly vote for it because it simply spends too much money. It spends money that we do not have, and it spends an enormous amount of money at a time when the American people are feeling the pinch of inflation. Inflation brought about predictably, foreseeably, by a government that spends way too much money. In effect, just printing more money. I mean, technically, I know there's an additional step involved in that. Technically, it's borrowed money. The Treasury issues instruments of debt. And in those instruments of debt, we borrow money from our creditors, lots of investors from all over America and throughout the world, who buy those instruments of debt from us. But because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and because many regard U.S. Treasuries as sort of the least bad investment of its kind, people will buy them, and this stuff functions almost, when we decide to issue additional debt, it functions almost as if we're hitting a button and just printing more money. When you print more money, and you have a relatively finite basket of goods and services that an economy can produce in a particular year. The same basket of goods, when that same basket of goods can be targeted by more money, inflation's going to hit. And people are going to have to pay more for the same things that they always need to buy. So, look, this doesn't necessarily hurt wealthy Americans. In fact, some of the wealthiest and most well-connected Americans will get rich off of legislation like this. Keep in mind, this legislation spends $1.2 trillion. The $550 billion number is the number that just refers to the new spending. So that means there was already roughly $700 billion that they were anticipating would be spent based on past practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to start all of this from the assumption that we will continue spending at that pace. But it certainly shouldn't obscure the fact that this is an enormous amount of money, $1.2 trillion that we'll be spending here. This at a time when Americans are feeling the pinch of inflation, precisely because of the pace at which we've been spending money. I mean, look, we were already spending way too much money even before COVID hit. In the last few years, we've typically been shelling out about $4 trillion a year through the federal government. And tragically, even at the top of the economic cycle, where we were right when COVID hit, we were still borrowing $1 out of every $4 we were spending. We were taking in about $3 trillion, spending about $4 before COVID hit. This at a time where we're at the top of the economic cycle, fantastic economic growth, record low unemployment, things were going great, and we were still borrowing $1 out of every $4 we were spending. COVID hits. Last year, instead of spending $4 trillion, which is already too much, we spent $6.7 trillion. So we spent $3.6 trillion more than we brought in. One of my colleagues recently pointed out to me that about 37% of all U.S. dollars that have ever come into existence have come into existence in the last 18 months. That by itself should help people understand why their dollars are going less far than they've ever gone before. Because when you just add to the money supply, when government spends that much money that it does not have, that does not exist, it lessens the buying power of every dollar of every American. Now there again, you've got some people, wealthy, well-connected individuals and corporations in this country who will get very rich off of a $1.2 trillion spending bill. They just will. We know it. They've got sophisticated analysts, lawyers, lobbyists, compliance specialists who I can assure you right now at this very moment are combing through that bill to figure out how they can get wealthy off of it. Those who don't get wealthy off of it, but who are already wealthy themselves, probably won't notice the pinch as much. Sure, they might notice that they're paying more for everything from gasoline to groceries to air travel, everything in between. But it probably won't impact their lifestyle, at least not for the top 1%. But then you've got pretty much everyone else. Pretty much everyone else in America who's not wealthy, not well-connected, who won't make money off of this, and isn't wealthy enough. Any person who's not wealthy enough to be able to cushion the blow of inflation to where it doesn't have to impact their lifestyle, pretty much everyone else, and that means the overwhelming majority of Americans. I mean, I'm talking about probably 95% of the men and women in America really will get hurt by this. Most people in America, in one way or another, are living paycheck to paycheck. And if their paycheck remains the same during a time period in which each dollar goes less far, that really hurts them. And if they're living close to the edge on what they can afford with that paycheck, and we further diminish the buying power of the dollar through our reckless spending in order to bring praise and adulation from the media and from each other, shame on us. That's reverse Robin Hood. That's stealing from the poor to give to the rich. So why then would we do that? Why would we do it right now? And by the way, because of this same spending spree, this orgiastic convulsion of federal spending for money that we do not have. We have labor shortages, and we have materials shortages. The cost of labor and the cost of materials that will go into these projects are costing more than they ever have before. So why is this the time to aggressively push something when we know full well that it will cost more right now because of other things that we've done, and that will in turn make other things that the American people need to buy more expensive? Shame on us for making poor and middle-class Americans poorer so that we can bring praise and adulation to ourselves and more money to a small handful of wealthy, well-connected interests in America. That begs the additional question. There's got to be an additional reason why you'd want to make all this spending federal. I mean, keep in mind, it's not just that most powers of government are and are supposed to be lodged in states and localities. That is also true. But it's also true that most infrastructure falls within the domain of states and localities. Most roads that people use from one day to the next are state roads or local roads. They're not federal. So why does all of this need to be federal? Why couldn't some of this? Why couldn't most of it? Why couldn't perhaps nearly all of either the new spending or all of the spending incorporated within this $1.2 trillion package? Why shouldn't that be something that states and localities could play a part in? Now, one might reason perhaps there's some additional efficiency that could come from the centralization of this plan. By making the plan federal, by making the money federal, maybe we can make it more efficient. We can standardize it. That argument might be compelling if it were true, but it isn't. Quite to the contrary, Mr. President. When you add federal money to any infrastructure project, the minute you add federal money to it, you attach a whole host of federal laws and federal regulations that the state or local government carrying out the work then has to comply with, such that if the project were not federal, if there were not federal dollars in place, they wouldn't have to comply with the same Byzantine labyrinth. They wouldn't have to negotiate this Byzantine labyrinth of federal regulations and mandates. This affects everything from the cost of labor to the cost of materials to the length of time needed to complete the product, the paperwork involved. And at the end of the day, it results in less of that money going into steel and concrete being placed in the ground, and a whole lot more of it going to lawyers, accountants, compliance specialists, and delays, frankly. In fact, this varies a little bit from state to state, but in many states, including my own, You often add 30%, sometimes it's closer to 40%, to the cost of a project the minute you add federal dollars, even just a few federal dollars. We'll add these requirements, and those requirements require a lot of additional money. But it's not the case that we make this more efficient, that we make each dollar stretch farther by consolidating it and distributing it back to the states, which is how these infrastructure projects often work. It's also intuitively something that doesn't add up. Why would we take money, bring it to Washington, run it through our filter, knowing that some of that money can slosh around, some of it will get lost administratively, and send it back? That wouldn't make things more efficient. Separate and apart from the fact that we make infrastructure more expensive when we do that, it doesn't make sense intuitively. All of this also arises in a context in which, due to the recent spending spree that we've been on in Washington, we're at a scary place with regard to our debt to GDP ratio. It's about 2 years ago when the Congressional Budget Office issued a report expressing some concerns for the fact that we were at the time, I believe, at about 79%. Our debt to GDP ratio was at about 79%. It's concerning because it had been mounting for some time. It was continuing to mount at the time. It was continuing tragically to mount, even though we were at the top of the economic cycle with good job growth, good economic growth, low unemployment, and so forth, and yet we were still adding to the debt at a rate of about $1 trillion per year. But they concluded, yes, 79% debt to GDP, and this is bad. They also forecast at the time that we might cross the dreaded 100% debt to GDP ratio within about a decade. I believe the prediction at the time was that we would cross that threshold sometime in maybe 2029. One of the reasons people worry about that is that there's been a lot of research done on this. A couple of economists from Stanford University wrote a book. The name of the book was This Time It's Different. It's one of many academic publications that have explored the relationship of the debt to GDP ratio and economic growth. They conclude that once you cross that threshold, 100% debt to GDP, economic growth tends to stall, and it becomes much more difficult to manage the federal debt at that point than the national debt that you're dealing with. And they've done this using models from all over the world, going back hundreds of years, and they've concluded that this is the threshold at which economies tend to stall out. And the name of the book was inspired by the fact that they said basically every country, when it approaches this sort of thing, the government tends to tell the people of that country, don't worry, we're different. This time it will be different. Just as Americans and the federal government tends to tell people this day, don't worry, this time it will be different. And they say it's not. This is real stuff. And so it was with some concern a couple of years ago when the Congressional Budget Office issued this report saying, yeah, we're at 79% now, and by the end of the 2020s, if we don't turn things around, we should be hitting 100% debt to GDP ratio. Just a couple of weeks ago, Mr. President, the CBO issued another report. That report concluded that by the end of this year, by the end of 2021, our debt to GDP ratio will be at a staggering 106%. So at that moment, we really should be very concerned. Because, look, regardless of how comfortable someone has been with deficit spending in the past, there are many people who brushed off concerns by it, by making an argument that, look, as long as the economy on the whole, in the big picture, is growing faster than the debt, we should be able to keep a lid on it. We should be able to prevent it from spinning out of control. Now, look, there's some real appeal to that argument. But that appeal starts to dwindle. In fact, it disappears entirely once your debt is growing much, much faster than your economy. And it gets even more concerning once you pass that 100% debt to GDP ratio, because at that point, many economists predict that you'll experience not just a cyclical, not just a periodic or episodic or short-term downturn in economic growth, but you'll experience a secular downturn, one that's likely to last much longer than that. So at a moment like that, I respectfully tend to think we should be asking ourselves the question about money that we're already spending. Should we even be spending money that we have already been planning to spend? The $700 billion that we had planned to spend over the next few years, perhaps that could be pared back. But instead, we're saying, no, we're going to do all of that, not cut back on any of it, and then we're going to add $550 billion to it. To me, that's kind of scary, especially when you take into account how all these things are interconnected. The fact that we've been spending too much, way too much, the fact that we've inflated the dollar as a result, that as a result of inflation, Americans are finding it harder to fill up their gas tank. They're finding it harder to pay their grocery bills, to pay for their rent or mortgage. They're finding it harder to do just about everything. So why would we want to step on the accelerator at that moment, which also happens to be the precise same moment when the cost of all the things that we will need to undertake this ambitious infrastructure spending package, including materials, steel, concrete, labor, everything else that we'll need in connection with that, when all those things are more expensive, and made more expensive still by the fact that we're making them all federal. Because when you use federal dollars for an infrastructure project, it typically costs a lot more. In a state like mine, it's often 30%, sometimes more than that. It costs that much more the minute you add federal dollars. For that reason, in my state and in many others, state transportation officials, they're very bright. My friend Carlos Braceras, who has been the longtime head of the Utah Department of Transportation, he and his team in the state of Utah, and with the help of Utah's governor and its legislature, they've figured out ways to make sure that when federal funding comes their way, that it doesn't bleed into everything. There are a number of projects that they try to keep insulated from federal spending, from federal dollars, specifically for the reason that it's likely to cost more and sometimes take longer if you involve federal dollars in it. So why would we want to continue exactly as we've been going and then add to it an additional $550 billion? Now, on the inflation side of this argument, some of my colleagues will argue, in fact, some of them argued tonight, that this is non-inflationary spending and that it's going to be lengthened it'll be spent over a lengthy period of time, and we therefore shouldn't worry about the impact it might have on inflation. I've got a couple of responses to that. First of all, the fact that we'll be spending it over the period of several years doesn't mean it won't have an impact on inflation. The fact is that when we spend more federal money, especially federal money that we don't have, that is the definition of inflationary. Now, maybe it's not as inflationary as it would have been had this bill spent 2 or 3 times that amount and had it mandated that it all be spent immediately, but it doesn't make it non-inflationary. Many of them also argued that it's okay because it's all paid for. The new money is all paid for. Well, it's one of the things that we'll be exploring over the next few days, and I hope we'll have even longer than that to wade through it. And on this point, I'd add simply that my colleagues, again, all senators for whom I have tremendous respect and affection, every one of these senators has worked on this, has worked hard on it, they're passionate about it, and I, I like them. I respect them, even though I disagree with them on this. But many of them pointed out that it's paid for, and yet when you look at the pay-fors, I wonder whether it actually is. Now, some of the arguments that they make in saying that it's all paid for rely on things like recapturing COVID monies, COVID funds already appropriated but not yet spent. I suppose that's a good thing to do. If we've got COVID money that we've appropriated but that hasn't been spent, I suppose we ought to recapture that and direct it somewhere else. But I'm not sure that that necessarily means that there's no cost or consequence to choosing to spend it here. I mean, if we appropriated more money for COVID than we should have, than we needed to, shouldn't we also consider, I don't know, giving it back to the American people, or paying down the debt so that we don't add to the debt as quickly? I think that ought to be on the table as well. So that's part of it, is the argument that we're taking a big chunk of it from COVID money that's previously been appropriated but not spent. They also rely on a number of other arguments, suggesting that it's paid for and not through tax increases or additional borrowing. Some of those arguments are I suppose, technically defensible, but not necessarily within the spirit of what they're saying. For example, there's a large sum of money, many billions of dollars. Last time I checked, their proposal was at about $13 billion to reinstate the fees attached to the production and distribution of certain chemicals. Like I say, last time I checked, the proposal was at about $13 billion falling into that category. It might be more or less because, again, we just now received the 2,702-page bill that now sits at the clerk's desk in front of us. So let's assume that it's $13 billion from the collection of that. Well, what that really is, based on my investigation of that, they're imposing taxes on the production and distribution of certain chemicals, many of which are used in the production of basically everything, basically all consumer products. So it's listed as a fee, not a tax. Sometimes the distinction between a fee and a tax can be relatively minor and relatively insignificant. But regardless, it's money that ends up being paid for by poor and middle-class Americans in the form of higher prices passed down to the consumer on everything that American consumers buy. The biggest difference between this and a tax is that with a tax, there's some record somewhere of what the taxpayer is paying. But with a fee that's going into basically every consumer product, in the case of many of these chemicals, it's a backdoor, invisible, sort of hidden tax. And so it's actually less desirable than a tax increase in that respect. Like I say, there are two purposes of our tax system. One is, the more obvious purpose is just to fund the government. But the other purpose is to communicate the cost of government to the voter, so that the voter knows what they're getting and what they're paying for it. Things like these hidden fees that will increase the cost of all manufactured items, maybe just a little, but with no price tag attached to it, it seems kind of unfair to me. Last I checked also, there were $56 billion counted among the pay-fors, $56 billion that they were counting on as something that would be collected by the federal government as tax revenue as a result of increased economic activity stemming specifically from the money that we're spending in this legislation. Now, I don't think we score infrastructure bills that way. To my knowledge, we haven't done that in the past. To my knowledge, the Congressional Budget Office, whose job it is to score these things, and which I hope will give us a score here. I don't think it typically scores infrastructure bills that way. To say, yeah, we're going to spend $1.2 trillion in this bill, but that $1.2 trillion being plowed into the economy is going to do other things, and that in turn will generate revenue and it will come back to us this way. You know, you sometimes hear of things like that being done from advocates of tax reform, and sometimes dynamic scoring has been done on tax reform. I don't think it's typically done with infrastructure projects. I also think it's wildly speculative to assume that $56 billion will come from this, and that $56 billion wouldn't come from the federal government if we weren't doing this. It goes back to the common fallacy with government. You can see the tangible things that government does, but seeing those tangible things that government does often obscures and makes impossible to know what would have been done in the absence of government intervention. What hospital wing won't be built as a result of people paying higher prices for everything they buy and higher prices on their tax bill and through inflation generally. You don't always see all the consequences built into that, but you can see the tangible benefits, which is exactly why this is such a tantalizing, tempting thing for politicians. Because look, when politicians vote to spend more money, not theirs, but everybody else's, the way things work in our society today, in our mainstream media today, you'll get praise for that. You'll pretty much always get praise for voting to spend more of the American people's money as long as you can identify good people who will benefit from it. And you can almost always do that. And I'm absolutely certain that there are a lot of good, deserving, hardworking Americans who will be able to point to things in this bill that they will benefit from. I won't take that away from the bill's sponsors, not for a moment. There are absolutely good things that will happen to good people, good, deserving people, if we pass this legislation. It's very tempting to do that because we'll get praised if we do it. And once we create the expectation that we're going to do it and then we don't do it, we'll get criticized. Predictably, those who vote for this will get praised in the media. Those who vote against it will get attacked as heartless and insensitive and not caring about those people who will benefit from it. But what, Mr. President, about the Americans who will be harmed by it? It's one of the tragic consequences of spending large volumes of money through a system of government. We have the luxury in government of collecting money by force. You know, usually that force doesn't have to be brought to bear directly. It's the implicit threat of the potential for use of force that allows governments to collect money. In fact, it's what differentiates governments from businesses or any other, or individuals or any other enterprise that might want to collect money in some way. Governments can use the implicit threat of force and carry out the threat of force when necessary in order to carry out our mandate. And so we always have to remember that even though we'll get praised for spending other people's money because there are good people who will benefit from it, there are other people who are harming. It's a tragic consequence of concentrated benefits and dispersed burdens attached to basically all spending legislation. I mean, it's really difficult. I don't know quite how to unravel it other than to say it's one of the many reasons why we should adhere to the constitutional norms established in 1787 as modified with each of the 27 amendments that we've adopted, and figuring out what is and what is not a federal priority. There are a lot of things that are good ideas. We don't have to utilize force or the implicit use of force or the potential use of force for all of them, but that's what we do when we push things through government. And when we push them through the federal government, we add other problems to them. Back to the drafters of this legislation. It took them 4 months to get to this. And again, I commend them for doing that. I don't fault them for the fact that it took them that long. I praise them for their willingness to dedicate their time, that much of their lives, to something they care about. I happen to disagree with where they're going with it, but I respect them nonetheless greatly for it. But think about this. This group that's been working together has been very, very intimately involved in the negotiation of the details of it. But it took them 4 months to get there. There are, 10 or so of them? But there are 100 of us. And we've got 435 counterparts in the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 tells us that you can't create legislation at the federal level without going through Congress. You can't pass federal legislation without it passing the House and passing the Senate and being presented to the President for signature or for veto. So it does still have to get through this body. What I would suggest, Mr. President, is that if it took these 10 or so of our colleagues 4 months to get here, it's not reasonable to expect that the rest of us can be brought to where they are in a matter of days. It's one of the reasons why we have committee processes. And I'm not of the view that there's no piece of legislation that ought to ever be passed without it having gone through a full committee process in regular order. There are lots of times when that might not be necessary or appropriate, or there might be other extenuating circumstances. I wonder here why that didn't happen, but regardless, the bill's here now, it's on the Senate floor now, we ought to consider it. But I would suggest this: if it took them 4 months to get comfortable with it, is it at all reasonable to expect that we should get through it and over the threshold of passing it, placing burdens on the American people that will last not just for years, but for decades, in a matter of days? Would it be unreasonable to suggest that we ought to at least have a few weeks to debate it and discuss it? That we ought to have at least half the time that they've had to prepare this? Took them 4 months, shouldn't we at least have a month or two? As we're approaching a time when members of Congress typically spend more time in their home states, is it at all unreasonable to suggest that maybe we ought to take that time to vet this with the people we represent in our respective states? I'd love nothing more, Mr. President, than to take that 2,702-page bill around the state of Utah with me in my visits to the state in the month of August. I'd love to get their input on it. I'd love for them to be able to have access to that document so we can have this debate and this discussion. And yeah, sure, I've got grave concerns with it. In its present form, I can't vote for it. That doesn't mean that we can't make it better. That doesn't mean that we can't all benefit a lot from having those who elected us have the chance to review this. Now, I don't expect that all 3.5 million Utahns will read that 2,702-page bill. It does not read like a fast-paced novel. But they still ought to have time to learn about what's in it, to at least read analysis performed by others and presented to them in a digestible form so that we can get their input on how it might affect their lives for good or for ill. Some of the other arguments that we've heard also need to be addressed. We've been told tonight that many of our peer nations are spending more money on infrastructure than we are. Not sure that's true in every case. In fact, there aren't a lot of countries on earth that can afford to spend anywhere near the amount of money that we spend on anything, infrastructure or otherwise. So if that's what they're suggesting, I'm not sure the argument pans out in a dollar for dollar or dollar for dollar equivalent analysis. If they're talking about as a percentage of GDP, yeah, maybe that's a good point. If we're talking about China, I'm not sure that we want to measure what we do and evaluate the sufficiency of what we do on infrastructure the same way China would. China, remember, has a very highly centralized form of government and a very highly centralized economy, which China being a communist dictatorship focuses around the government, around their national government. Well, that's a critical difference. I don't think the Chinese model is one that we want to emulate here. The argument was also made that many in Europe are spending more. Perhaps, again, perhaps they mean as a percentage of GDP. I'm not sure. I'd note here that, many countries in Europe have the luxury of doing a lot of things that we don't, in part because of the burden that we carry for them on issues of national defense. Even with that, I would doubt very highly that any country in Europe spends more dollars or more dollar equivalents of whatever currency they use than the United States. So I'm not sure what was meant by that argument. We have to remember, Mr. President, that any time a politician, any time an elected official says, "You need me," the opposite is true. He or she, when saying "you need me," is actually saying, "I need you." People aren't here to serve the government. The government exists for the purpose of serving the people. So we've got to be very, very wary of anything that sounds like we're telling the people, "You need us. You need us to take money from you and to take money from your yet unborn children, or from your children who are alive today but not yet old enough to vote, and spend it in the manner that we deem fit." For that additional reason, we should be extra cautious. As much as I love and respect the colleagues who have put together this 2,702-page bill, I want to go through it to make sure that it spends money in the way that my constituents would like, which is all the more reason why, if it took them 4 months, shouldn't we really at least take a few weeks with it and not just a few days? $1.2 trillion. This is what this bill wants to spend. It's easy to get caught up in the words million, billion, trillion. In fact, for most of our colleagues, most of us at one point or another have made the mistake, hopefully not in public as much, but at least in our private conversations, as we discuss large numbers necessarily involved in funding a government as large as ours is. Sometimes we'll find ourselves saying million when we mean billion, or billion when we mean trillion, or some other combination of syntactic errors. There is a big difference between them, a thousand-fold difference at every level. Remember that a number of people have pointed out recently, in order to encapsulate the point, 1 million seconds will last just 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds lasts 31.69 years. 1 trillion seconds lasts 31,688.74 years. There's an enormous difference here, an enormous difference that we ought to take into account. So I don't mean to suggest that any of this is easy. It's not easy at all. But we ought to get concerned anytime someone proposes that we spend this much money all at once. We've got to do our due diligence. Now, people like to talk about roads, bridges, wastewater projects. They like to talk about potholes. Those things are all really important.
My colleague just yield for a minute for a brief interruption. I'll close the Senate, but then allow him to speak.
I'd be happy to defer.
As long as he should choose. I see he doesn't have many notes, but it's all sui generis. I know that. And okay.
I'm not sure it's sui generis there, but we'll give, yeah, go ahead.
No comment. Okay, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, to adjourn until 12 noon, Monday, August 2nd, and that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate resume consideration of H.R. 3684.
Is there an objection? No objection? Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Lee. I yield the
Without
floor. I
objection.
yield back to the senator from Utah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate my friend and colleague, the Majority Leader, for allowing me to finish my remarks this evening. So when we look at legislation like this, I hope we can pay attention to a few details that focus on more than just our ridges, our roads, bridges, wastewater projects, and other infrastructure matters. Are they important? I hope we will ask specifically, are they appropriately federal? Could they be just as easily handled as some other level of government? I hope that we will also ask, if they are appropriate for the federal government, are we spending appropriately there? And are we doing it at the right time? Are we placing the dollars that we are going to spend on the right things? I also hope, Mr. President, that we'll pay careful attention to something that my friend and my distinguished colleague from Arizona, Senator Sinema, said. She pointed out that throughout this process, it was difficult and time-consuming. But I liked how she put it. She said, it's supposed to be that way. Our founding fathers set up a system in which it would necessarily be difficult and time-consuming to get there. And she's absolutely right. It's not supposed to be easy to pass legislation, because legislation, especially like this, impacts a lot of people who are not here. There are only 100 of us who have the privilege of serving in this body, and we've got 330 million people in this country who will be affected by it. And they'll be affected by it for a long time to come. So that's why it's supposed to be difficult and time-consuming. So there again, I'd point back to the fact that it took this group, they're not a committee, but this group of 10 or so senators, 4 painstaking months to come up with this. And it's to their credit that they were able to get it done even in that amount of time. Again, I don't agree with the conclusion that they reached. I can't vote for this bill as it's written, but that really is remarkable that they were able to do it in that period of time. But the fact that they, as a small group, were able to do that in 4 months means that this body has no business passing this legislation in a matter of just a few days. Quite arguably, we should need more time than that, not less, to digest it, but let's just, for the sake of discussion and for the sake of respecting what appears to be a widely held view in this body that we ought to act on this, we at least need a few weeks. We shouldn't be doing this in just a few days. I also hope that we will keep in mind that every one of us in this body holds an election certificate, whether we participated in the drafting of this bill or not. And every one of us should have the opportunity to offer up amendments and to vote on those amendments, to make improvements to the bill. Whether we support it in its current form or not, whether we intend to vote for the finished package or not, every one of us deserves an opportunity to offer up as many amendments as we may choose. And if we want them voted on, they should be voted on. We shouldn't be afraid of it. Often it's through the amendment process that we discover the nooks and crannies. We discover the unintended consequences. We allow the public to have visibility into what has been a process that most people don't have access to. So I hope that we'll do that and that we'll be respectful to each other's views in doing that. Bad things happen when legislation, especially legislation spending as much money as this one does, or anything close to it, is drafted in secret. Look, there's no problem. I don't have a problem at all with the fact that they've been meeting. Members have every prerogative to decide what they want to propose behind closed doors. That's how the deliberative process works that results in legislation. But once it's here, as it is now, we need to take into account the fact that this hasn't been through committee, this hasn't been aired in its current form. We've got to give it the adequate airing that it needs and that the American people deserve.